Section 9 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Malone. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. Great Navigators of the 18th Century, by Jules Verne. First Part, Chapter 2, Part 3. Captain Cook's Predecessors, 3b. On the 16th of January, in endeavoring to reach Rupert Isle, the Boudeuse was driven by the currents half a cable's length from the shore. The anchor, which was then heaved, gave way, and without the least land breeze the vessel stranded. It was necessary to regain Gallant Harbour. It was just time, for next day a fearful storm was raging. After experiencing constantly adverse and variable winds for 26 days in Port Gallant, 36 hours favourable breeze, for which we had not dared to hope, sufficed to take us into the Pacific Ocean. This I believe to be a solitary instance of a voyage without anchorage from Port Gallant to the narrow channel. I estimate the entire length of this strait, from Virgin Cape to Cape Pellier, at about 114 leagues. We took 52 days to accomplish it, in spite of the difficulties we met with in the passage of the Straits of Magellan, and in this Bougainville entirely agrees with Byron. I should advise this route in preference to that by Cape Horn from September to the end of March. During the remaining months of the year I should prefer the open sea. Contrary winds and heavy seas are not dangerous, whilst it is not wise to grope one's way between two coasts. One is sure to be detained for some time in the strait, but this delay is not time wholly lost. One meets with water in abundance, wood and shellfish, and occasionally very good fish, and I am decidedly of opinion that a crew reaching the Pacific by doubling Cape Horn suffers more from the ravages of scurvy than that which proceeds by the Straits of Magellan. Bougainville's opinion has met with many opposers up to the present time, and the route which he lauds so highly has been almost abandoned by navigators. One strong reason for which is that steam has completely transformed maritime experience and entirely changed nautical science. Scarcely had he entered the southern sea when Bougainville, to his intense surprise, found the winds southerly. He was therefore obliged to relinquish his intention of reaching Juan Fernandez. Bougainville had agreed with Monsieur de la Gironde, captain of the Étoile, that if a larger stretch of sea was discovered, the two vessels should separate, but not lose sight of each other, and that every evening the bugle should recall them within half a league of each other, so that, in the event of the Boudeuse encountering danger, the Étoile might avoid it. Bougainville for some time sought Easter Island in vain. At last he fell in during the month of March with the lands and islands erroneously marked upon Monsieur Bellini's chart as Quiros Islands. On the 22nd of the same month he met with 4 islets, to which he gave the name of Quatre Facardins, which belonged to the dangerous group, a set of madreporic islets, low and damp, which all navigators who have visited the Pacific Ocean by way of the Straits of Magellan appear to have noticed. A little further discovery was made, of a fertile island inhabited by entirely naked savages, who were armed with long spears, which they brandished with menacing gestures, and thus it obtained the name of Lancer's Island. We need not refer to what we have already repeatedly said of the nature of these islands, the difficulty of access to them, their wild and inhospitable inhabitants. Cook calls them this very Lancer's Island, Thrum Cape, and the inhabitants of La Alpe, which Bougainville found on the 24th, is identical with Cook's Bow Island. The captain, knowing that Roger wine had nearly perished in these latitudes, and thinking the interest of their explorations not worth the risk to be run, proceeded southward, and soon lost sight of this immense archipelago, which extends in length 500 leagues, and contains at least 60 islands or groups. Upon the 2nd of April, Bougainville perceived a high and steep mountain, to which he gave the name of La Boudeuse. It was Maitea Island, already called La Detsana by Quiros. On the 4th, at sunrise, the vessel reached Tahiti, a long island consisting of 2 peninsulas, united by a tongue of land no more than a mile in width. More than 100 pirogues hastened to surround the 2 vessels. They were laden with cocoanuts and many delicious fruits, which were readily exchanged for all sorts of trifles. When night fell, the shore was illuminated by 1,000 fires, to which the crew responded by throwing rockets. The appearance of this shore, says Bougainville, raised like an amphitheatre, offered a most attractive picture. Although the mountains are high, the land nowhere shows its nakedness, being covered with wood. We could scarcely credit our sight when we perceived a peak, covered with trees, which rose above the level of the mountains in the southern portion of the island. It appeared only 30 fathoms in diameter, and decreased in size at its summit. At a distance it might have been taken for an immense pyramid, adorned with foliage by a clever decorative. The least elevated portions of the country are intersected by fields and groves, and the entire length of the coast, upon the shore below the higher level, is a stretch of low land, unbroken and covered by plantations. There, amid the bananas, cocoanut, and other fruit trees, we saw the huts of the natives. The whole of the morrow was spent in barter. The natives, in addition to fruits, offered fowls, pigeons, fishing instruments, working implements, stuffs, and shells, for which they asked nails and earrings. Upon the morning of the 6th, after 3 days devoted to tacking about and reconnoitering the coast in search of a roadstead, Bougainville decided to cast anchor in the bay he had seen the first day of his arrival. The number of pirogues round our vessels, he says, was so great that we had immense trouble in making our way through the crowd and noise. All approached crying "Tayo," friend, and offering 1,000 marks of friendship. The pirogues were full of women, who might vie with most Europeans in pleasant features, and who certainly excelled them in beauty of form. Bougainville's cook managed to escape, in spite of all prohibitions, and gained the shore. But he had no sooner landed than he was surrounded by a vast crowd, who entirely undressed him to investigate his body. Not knowing what they were going to do with him, he thought himself lost, when the natives restored his clothes and conducted him to the vessel more dead than alive. Bougainville wished to reprimand him, but the poor fellow assured him that, However he might threaten him, he could never equal the terrors of his visit on shore. As soon as the ship could heave to, Bougainville landed with some of his officers to reconnoitre the watering place. An enormous crowd immediately surrounded him and examined him with great curiosity, all the time crying, "Tayo, Tayo." One of the natives received them in his house, and served them with fruits, grilled fish, and water. As they regained the shore, a native of fine appearance, lying under a tree, offered them a share of the shade. "We accepted it," says Bougainville, "and the man at once bent towards us in a gentle way, sung, to the sound of a flute which another Indian blew with his nose, a song which was no doubt Anacreontic. It was a charming scene, worthy of the pencil of Boucher. 4 natives came with great confidence to sup and sleep on board. We had the flute, bassoon, and violin played for them, and treated them to fireworks composed of rockets and serpents. This display excited both surprise and fear." Before giving further extracts from Bougainville's narrative, it appears apropos to warn the reader not to accept these descriptions au pied de la lettre. The fertile imagination of the narrator embellished everything. Not content with the ravishing scenes under his eyes, the picturesque reality is not enough for him, and he adds new delights to the picture, which only overload it. He does this almost unconsciously. None the less, his descriptions should be received with great caution. We find a strange example of this tendency of the age in the narrative of Cook's second voyage. Mr. Hodges, the painter who was attached to the expedition, wishing to reproduce the disembarkation of the English on the island of Middleburg, paints personages who have not the smallest resemblance to the dwellers in the ocean regions, and whose togas give them the appearance of being contemporaries of Caesar or of Augustus. Yet he had the originals before his eyes, and nothing could have been easier to him than to depict the scene as it really was. We know better how to respect truth in these days. No additions, no embellishments are found in the narratives of our navigators, and if sometimes they prove but dry accounts, which give little pleasure to the general public, they are sure to contain the elements of earnest study for the scientific man, and the basis of works for the advancement of science. With this preamble, let us follow the narrator. Bougainville established his sick and his water casks upon the shore of a small river which ran at the bottom of the bay, under a guard for their security. These precautions were not taken without arousing the susceptibility and distrust of the natives. They had no objection to seeing the strangers walk about their island all day, but they expected them to return on board at night. Bougainville persisted, and at last he was obliged to fix the length of his stay. At this juncture harmony was restored. A large shed was prepared for the sufferers from scurvy, in number 34, and for their guard, which consisted of 30 men. The shed was closed on all sides, and only one opening left, to which the natives crowded with the wares they wished to exchange. The only trouble they had was in keeping an eye upon everything that was brought on shore, for there are no more adroit sharpers in Europe than these folks. Following a laudable custom, now becoming general, Bougainville presented the chief of this settlement with a pair of turkeys, and ducks, and drakes, and then cleared a piece of land where he sowed corn, wheat, rice, maize, onions, and so on. On the 10th, a native was killed by a gunshot. All Bougainville's inquiries failed to find out the perpetrator of this abominable assassination. Apparently the natives thought the victim in the wrong, for they continued to frequent the market with their former confidence. The captain, however, knew that the harbour was not well sheltered, and the bottom was entirely coral. On the 12th, during a storm of wind, the Boudeuse, whose anchor cable had been cut by the coral, caused great injuries to the Étoile, upon which she was driven. Whilst all on board were busily occupied in repairing these injuries, and a boat had been dispatched in search of a second passage, by means of which the ships might have left with any wind, Bougainville learned that 3 natives had been killed or wounded in their cabins by bayonets, and that, owing to the general alarm, all the inhabitants had hurried to the interior. In spite of the risk run by his ships, the captain at once landed, and put the supposed perpetrators of this outrage, which might have brought the entire population upon the French, into irons. Thanks to these rigorous measures, the natives calmed down, and the night passed without incident. Still, Bougainville's worst apprehensions were not upon this score. He returned on board as soon as possible. But for a breeze which opportunely sprang up, both vessels would have been driven on shore by a strong squall, accompanied by a swell and thunder. The anchor cables broke, and the vessels had a narrow escape of striking on the breakers, where they must speedily have been demolished. Fortunately, the Étoile was able to gain the open, and was soon followed by the Boudeuse, leaving in this foreign roadstead 6 anchors, which might have been of great use during the rest of the voyage. So soon as they perceived the approaching departure of the French, the natives came in crowds with provisions of every variety. One of them, named Aoturu, asked, and finally obtained, permission to accompany Bougainville on his voyage. After his arrival in Europe, Aoturu lived 11 months in Paris, where he was received with cordiality and welcome in the highest society. In 1770, when he returned to his native land, the government took an opportunity of conveying him to the Isle of France. He was to return to Tahiti as soon as the weather permitted, but he died in the island without having been able to convey to his land the useful implements, grains, and cattle which had been given to him by the French government. Tahiti, which was named Nouvelle Cythère by Bougainville, on account of the beauty of the women, is the largest of the Society's group. Although it was visited, as we have already narrated, by Wallace, we will give a little information which we owe to Bougainville. The principal productions were cocoas, bananas, breadfruits, yams, sugar-cane, and so on. Monsieur de Commerson, naturalist, who was on board the Étoile, recognized the Indian flora. The only quadrupeds were pigs, dogs, and rats, who multiplied rapidly. Bougainville says, "The climate is so healthy that, in spite of our fatigues, although our people were perpetually in the water and under a burning sun, sleeping on the naked soil under the stars, no one was ill. The sufferers from scurvy whom we disembarked, and who had not enjoyed a single night's sleep, regained their strength, and were so soon restored that some of them were completely cured on board. In addition to all this, the health and strength of the natives, who live in cabins open to every wind, and who scarcely cover the ground which serves them as a bed, with a few leaves, the happy old age to which they easily attain, the sharpness of all their senses, and the singular beauty of their teeth, which they preserve to the greatest age, all testify to the salubrity of the climate, and the efficiency of the rules followed by the inhabitants. In character, the people seem gentle and good. It would not appear that they have civil wars among themselves, although the country is divided into little portions under independent chiefs. They are constantly at war with the inhabitants of the neighboring islands. Not satisfied with massacring the men and male children taken in arms, they skin their chins with the beard, and keep this hideous trophy. Bougainville could only obtain very vague information of their ceremonies and religion, but he could at least assert the reverence they pay their dead. They preserve the corpses for a long time in the open air, on a sort of scaffold sheltered by a shed. In spite of the odor of decomposition, the women go every day to weep near the monuments, and bedew the sad relics of their beloved ones with their tears and with cocoa-nut oil. The soil is so productive and requires so little cultivation that men and women live in a state of almost entire idleness. Therefore it is not astonishing that the sole care of the latter is to be pleasing. Dancing, singing, long conversations, teeming with gaiety, have developed a mobility of expression among the Tahitians, surprising even to the French, a people who themselves have not the reputation of being serious, possibly because they are more lively than those who reproach them with levity. It is impossible to fix a native's attention. A trifle strikes them, but nothing occupies them. In spite of their want of reflection, they were clever and industrious. Their pirogues were constructed after a fashion equally ingenious and solid. Their fish-hooks and all their fishing implements were of delicate workmanship. Their nets were like those of Europeans. Their stuffs, manufactured of the bark of a tree, were generally woven and dyed of various colors. In fact, Bougainville's impression of the Tahitian people was that they were lazzaroni. At 8 o'clock on the 16th of April, Bougainville was about 10 leagues north of Tahiti, when he perceived land to windward. Although it had the appearance of 3 islands, it was in reality but one. It was named Umaita, after Aoturu. The captain, not thinking it wise to stop there, steered so as to avoid the pernicious islands, of which Roggewein's disaster had made him afraid. During the remainder of the month of April the weather was fine, with little wind. On the 3rd of May, Bougainville bore down towards a new land, which he had just discovered, and was not long in finding others on the same day. The coasts of the largest one were steep. In point of fact, it was simply a mountain covered with trees to its summit, with neither valley nor sea-coast. Some fires were seen there, cabins built under the shade of the cocoa-nut trees, and some 30 men running on the shore. In the evening several pirogues approached the vessels, and after a little natural hesitation exchanges commenced. The natives demanded pieces of red cloth in exchange for cocoa-nuts, yarns, and far less beautiful stuffs than those of the Tahitians. They disdainfully refused iron, nails, and earrings, which had been so appreciated elsewhere in the Bourbon archipelago, as Bougainville had named the Tahitian group. The natives had their breasts and thighs painted dark blue. They wore no beards. Their hair was drawn into tufts on the top of their heads. Next day fresh islands belonging to the archipelago were seen. The natives, who appeared very savage, would not approach the vessels. The longitude of these islands, says the narrative, is pretty nearly similar to that which Abel Tasman reckoned it when he discovered Amsterdam and Rotterdam Islands, the Pilstars, Prince William Island, and the lowlands of Flemskerk. It is also approximate to that assigned for the Solomon Islands. Besides, the pirogues which we have seen rowing in the open sea, and to the south, indicate other islands in this locality. Thus it appears likely that these lands form an extended chain in the same parallel. The islands comprising the Navigator Archipelago lie below the 14th southern parallel, between 170 degrees and 172 degrees west longitude from Paris. As fresh victuals diminished, scurvy again began to appear. It was necessary to think of putting into a port again. On the 22nd and the following days of the same month, Pentecost Island, Aurora, and Leper Islands, which belonged to the archipelago of New Hebrides, were reconnoitred. They had been discovered by Quiros in 1606. The landing appearing easy, the captain determined to send an expedition on shore, which would bring back cocoanuts and other antiscorbutic fruits. Bougainville joined them during the day. The sailors cut wood, and the natives aided in shipping it. But in spite of this apparent good feeling, the natives were still distrustful, and carried their weapons in their hands. Those who possessed none held large stones, all ready to throw. As soon as the boats were laden with fruit and wood, Bougainville re-embarked his men. The natives then approached in great numbers, and discharged a shower of arrows, lances, and javelins. Some even entered the water, the better to aim at the French. Several gunshots, fired into the air, having no effect, a well-directed general volley soon put the natives to flight. A few days later, a boat seeking anchorage upon the coast of the Leper Islands was in danger of attack. 2 arrows aimed at them served as a pretext for the first discharge, which was speedily followed by a fire so well directed that Bougainville believed his crew in danger. The number of victims was very large. The natives uttered piercing cries as they fled to the woods. It was a regular massacre. The captain, uneasy at the prolonged firing, sent another boat to the help of the first, when he saw it doubling a point. He therefore signalled for their return. "I took measures," he said, "that we should never again be dishonoured by such an abuse of our superior forces." The easy abuse of their powers by captains is truly sad. The mania for destroying life needlessly, even without any object, raises one's indignation. To whatever nation explorers belong, we find them guilty of the same acts. The reproach therefore belongs not to a particular nation, but to humanity at large. Having obtained the commodities he needed, Bougainville regained the sea. It would appear that the navigator aimed at making many discoveries, for he only reconnoitred the lands he found very superficially and hastily, and of all the charts which accompany the narrative, and there are many of them, not one gives an entire archipelago, or settles the various questions to which a new discovery gives rise. Captain Cook did not proceed in this way. His explorations, always conducted with care, and with rare perseverance, are for that very reason far superior in value to those of the French explorers. End of Section 9. Recording by Malone.
Section 10 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2, Great Navigators of the 18th Century, by Jules Verne. First Part, Chapter 2, Part 3. Captain Cook's Predecessors, 3c. The lands which the French now encountered were no other than Saint Esprit, Mallicolo, and Saint Bartholomew, and the islets belonging to the latter. Although he was perfectly aware that these islands were identical with the Tierra del Espiritu Santo of Quiros, Bougainville could not refrain from bestowing a new name upon them, and called them the Archipelago de Grandes Cyclades, to which, however, the name of New Hebrides has been given in preference. I readily believed, he says, that it was its extreme southern point, which Roggevайн saw under the 11th parallel, and which he named Tienhoven and Groningue. But when we arrived there everything led us to believe that we were in the southern land of Espiritu Santo. Every appearance seemed to coincide with Quiros's narrative, and the discoveries we made every day encouraged us in our search. It is singular that precisely in the same latitude and longitude as that which Quiros gives to his St. Philip and St. James's Bays, upon a shore which at first sight appeared like a continent, we found a passage equal in size to that which he gives to the opening of his bays. Did the Spanish navigator see badly, or did he wish to hide his discoveries? Had geographers merely guessed in making the Tierra del Espiritu Santo identical with New Guinea? To ascertain the truth, we must follow the same parallel for over 350 leagues. I resolved upon doing so, although the state and quantity of our provisions warned us to seek a European settlement as soon as possible. It will be seen that we narrowly escaped being the victims of our own persistence." Whilst Bougainville was in these latitudes, certain business matters required his presence on board the Etoile, and he there found out a singular fact, which had already been largely discussed by his crew. Monsieur de Commerson had a servant named Barré. Indefatigable, intelligent, and already an experienced botanist, Barré had been seen taking an active part in the herborizing excursions, carrying boxes, provisions, the weapons, and books of plants, with endurance which obtained from the botanist the nickname of his beast of burden. For some time past Barré had been supposed to be a woman. His smooth face, the tone of his voice, his reserve, and certain other signs, appeared to justify the supposition, when on arriving at Tahiti suspicions were changed into certainty. Monsieur de Commerson landed to botanize, and according to custom Barré followed him with the boxes, when he was surrounded by natives, who, exclaiming that it was a woman, were disposed to verify their opinion. A midshipman, Monsieur Beaumont, had the greatest trouble in rescuing her from the natives and escorting her back to the ship. When Bougainville visited the Etoile, he received Barré's confession. In tears, the assistant botanist confessed her sex, and excused herself for having deceived her master by presenting herself in man's clothes at the very moment of embarkation. Having no family, and having been ruined by a lawsuit, this girl had donned man's clothes to ensure respect. She was aware, before she embarked, that she was going on a voyage round the world, and the prospect, far from frightening her, only confirmed her in her resolution. "She will be the first woman who has been round the world," says Bougainville, "and I must do her the justice to admit that she has conducted herself with the most scrupulous discretion. She is neither ugly nor pretty, and at most is only 26 or 27 years old. It must be admitted that had the two vessels suffered shipwreck upon a desert island, it would have been a singular experience for Barré." The expedition lost sight of land on the 29th of May. The route was directed westward. On the 4th of June, a very dangerous rock, so slightly above water that at 2 leagues distant it was not visible from the lookout, was discovered in latitude 15 degrees 50 minutes and 148 degrees 10 minutes longitude. The constant recurrence of breakers, trunks of trees in large quantities, fruits and sea wrack, and the smoothness of the sea, all indicated the neighbourhood of extensive land to the southeast. It was New Holland. Bougainville determined to leave these dangerous latitudes, where he was likely to meet with nothing but barren lands, and a sea strewn with rocks and full of shallows. There were other urgent reasons for changing the route, provisions were getting low, the salt meat was so tainted that the rats caught on board were eaten in preference. Bread enough for 2 months, and vegetables for 40 days alone remained. All clamoured for a return to the north. Unfortunately the south winds had ceased, and when they recommenced they brought the expedition within an inch of destruction. On the 10th of June land was seen to the north. It was the bottom of the Gulf of the Louisiade, which had received the name of Cul-de-sac de l'Orangerie. The country was magnificent. On the seashore a low land covered with trees and shrubs, the balmy odours of which reached the ships, rose like an amphitheatre towards the mountains, whose summits were lost in the skies. However, it was impossible to visit this rich and fertile country, but on the other hand desirable to find to the east a passage to the south of New Guinea, which, by way of the Gulf of Carpentaria, would have led direct to the Moluccas. Did such a passage exist? Nothing was more problematic, for the notion was that land had been seen extending far to the westward. It was needful to hurry as fast as possible from the gulf where the ships had so incautiously involved themselves. But there is a wide difference between a wish and its fulfilment. The two vessels strove in vain, up to the 21st of June, to transport themselves to the west, from this coast, which was so full of rocks and breakers, and upon which the wind and currents bade fair to swallow them up. The fog and rain continued so closely with them, that the frigate could only proceed in company with the Etoile by a constant firing of guns. When the wind changed they profited by it, and immediately proceeded to the open sea; but it soon veered again, and continued east-south-east, and thus they speedily lost the ground they had gained. During this terrible cruise the rations of bread and vegetables were obliged to be reduced, consumption of old leather was threatened with severe punishment, and the last goat on board was sacrificed. It is difficult for the reader, tranquilly sitting in his chimney corner, to imagine the anxiety of a voyage in these unknown seas, threatened with the unexpected appearance of rocks and breakers, with contrary winds, unknown currents, and a fog which concealed all dangers. Cape Deliverance was only rounded on the 26th. It was now possible to start for the north-northeast. 2 days later, when they had made about 60 leagues northward, some islands were perceived ahead. Bougainville imagined they were part of the Louisiade group, but they are more generally accepted as belonging to the Solomon Archipelago, which Carteret, who saw them the preceding year, as little imagined that he had reached as the French navigator. Several pirogues speedily surrounded the two ships. They were manned by natives, blacker than Africans, with long curling red hair. Armed with javelins, they uttered shrill cries, and showed dispositions far from peaceful. It was useless to attempt to reach them. The surge broke violently, and the coast was so narrow that it scarcely seemed as if there were one at all. Surrounded on all sides by islands, and in a thick fog, Bougainville steered by instinct in a passage only 4 or 5 leagues in width, and with a sea so rough that the Etoile was forced to close her hatchways. Upon the eastern coast a pretty bay was perceived, which promised good anchorage. Boats were told off to sound it. Whilst they were thus engaged, 10 or more pirogues, upon which some 150 men armed with bucklers, lances, and bows, were embarked, advanced against them. The pirogues divided into 2 parties to surround the French boats. As soon as they were within sufficient reach, the natives showered a storm of arrows and javelins upon the boats. The first discharge failed to stop them. A second was necessary to disperse them. 2 pirogues, the crews of which had jumped into the sea, were captured. Of great length and well made, these boats were decorated in front with a man's head carved, the eyes of which were formed of mother of pearl, the ears of tortoise shell, and the lips painted red. The water in which this combat took place was called the Warrior River, and the island received the name of Choiseul in honor of the French Minister of Marine. On leaving this strait a new land was discovered, Bougainville Island, the southern extremity of which, called Laverdy Cape, appears to join Bouka Island. The latter, which Carteret had seen the preceding year, and which he named Winchelsea, appeared densely populated, if the cabins which abounded were any criterion. The inhabitants, whom Bougainville classifies as negroes, probably to distinguish them from the Polynesians and Malays, were Papuans, of the same race as the inhabitants of New Guinea. Their short curly hair was painted red, and the betel nut, which they perpetually chewed, had communicated the same colour to their teeth. The coast with its cocoanut and other trees promised plentiful refreshments, but contrary winds and currents quickly drew the ships away. On the 6th of July Bougainville cast anchor on the southern coast of New Ireland, which had been discovered by Schouten, in Port Praslin, at the very point where Carteret had stopped. "We sent our casks on shore," says the narrative, "and began to collect water and food, and commence washing, all of which was most necessary. The disembarkation was splendid, upon fine sand, with neither rock nor wave. 4 streams flowed into the harbour in a space measuring 400 paces. We selected 3 according to custom, one to supply water for the La Boudeuse, one for the Etoile, and one for washing purposes. Wood was plentiful on the shore, and there were various kinds of it, all good for burning, and several first rate for carpentry, joinery, and even toy making. The 2 vessels were in hearing of each other and close to the shore. Again this part and its neighbourhood to a great distance were uninhabited, a fact which secured us precious peace and liberty. We could not have hoped for a surer anchorage, or a more convenient spot for water, wood, or the various repairs needed by the vessels. We were able to send the sufferers from scurvy to range the woods. But with all these advantages the port had a few inconveniences. In spite of active search, neither cocoanut trees nor bananas were to be found, nor any of the resources which either by consent or by force could have been gained in an inhabited country. Fish was not abundant, and we could expect only safety and strictly necessary things. There was every fear that the sick would not re-establish their health. We had, indeed, no serious cases, but several were infected, and no improvement took place, and their malady could not have increased more rapidly." They had been only a few days in port, when a sailor found a leaden plate, upon which was an inscription in English. It was easy to guess that they had found the very spot where Carteret had made a stay the preceding year. The resources offered by this country to sportsmen were mediocre in the extreme. They did indeed catch sight of a few boars or wild pigs, but it was impossible to hit them. To make up for this, they shot most beautiful pigeons, the bodies and necks of grey-white, and of golden-green plumage, turtle-doves, paroquets, crested birds, and a species of crow whose cry was so like the baying of a dog as to be mistaken for it. The trees were large and magnificent, amongst them the betel, the areca, and the pepper tree. Malignant reptiles swarm in these marshy lands, and in the ancient forests serpents, scorpions, and other venomous reptiles abounded. Unfortunately they were not only to be found on land. A sailor in search of marteaux, a very rare kind of bivalve mussel, was stung by a serpent. The fearful suffering and violent convulsions which followed only subsided at the expiration of 5 or 6 hours, and at last the theriac which was administered for him after the bite effected a cure. This accident was a sad damper to the conchological enthusiasm. Upon the 22nd, after a severe storm, the ships were sensible of several slight earthquakes, the sea rose and fell several times in succession, which greatly alarmed the sailors who were occupied in fishing. In spite of the rain and ceaseless storms which continued daily, a detachment started to search the interior for bourbon palms, palm trees, and turtle doves. They expected to find wonders, but returned oftenest empty-handed and with the one result of being wet to the skin. A natural curiosity at some distance from the anchorage, 1,000 times more beautiful than the wonders invented for the ornament of kingly palaces, attracted numberless visitors, who could never tire of admiring it. It was a waterfall, too beautiful for a description. To form any idea of its beauty, it would be necessary to reproduce by the brush the sparkling gleam of the spray lit up by the rays of the sun, the vaporous shade of the tropical trees which dipped their branches into the water, and the fantastic display of light over a magnificent country not yet spoiled by the hand of men. As soon as the weather changed, the ships left Port Praslin, to follow the coast of New Guinea, until the 3rd of August. The Etoile was attacked by hundreds of pirogues, and forced to return the stones and arrows that assailed her by a few gunshots, which put the assailants to flight. On the 4th, the islands named Matthias and Stormy by Dampier were sighted. 3 days later Anchorite Island was recognized, so called because a number of pirogues occupied in fishing took no notice of the Etoile and Boudous, disdaining to enter into relations with the strangers. After passing a series of islets half under water, upon which the vessels nearly struck, and which were named the Echequiers by Bougainville, the coast of New Guinea appeared. Steep and mountainous, it ran west-northwest. On the 12th a large bay was discovered, but the currents, which so far had been unfavourable, were equally so in carrying the boats far from it. It was visible at a distance of 20 leagues from 2 gigantic mountains, Cyclops and Bougainville. The Aramoa Islands, the largest of which is only 4 miles in length, were next seen, but the bad weather and the currents forced the 2 vessels to remain in the open sea, and relinquish all exploration. It was necessary, however, to maintain a close watch in order to avoid missing the outlet into the Indian Ocean. Mispulu and Waigiou, the last at the extreme north of New Guinea, were passed in succession. The Canal des Français, the outlet for ships from this mass of little islands and rocks, was passed without mishap. From thence Bougainville penetrated to the Molucca archipelago, where he reckoned upon finding the fresh provisions requisite for the 45 sufferers from scurvy on board. In absolute ignorance of the events which had occurred in Europe since he left it, Bougainville could not run the risk of visiting a colony in which he was not the strongest power. The small Dutch establishment, Boton or Bourou Island, suited him perfectly, all the more that provisions were easily obtained there. The crew received orders to enter the Gulf of Cajeti with the greatest delight. No one on board had escaped scurvy, and half the crew, Bougainville says, were quite unfit for duty. "The victuals remaining to us were so tainted and ill-smelling, that the worst moments of our sad days were those when we were obliged to partake of such disgusting and unwholesome viands. The charms of Boton Island were enhanced by our wretched situation." About midnight a delicious odour, emanating from the aromatic plants with which the Molucca Islands are covered, had been wafted several leagues out to sea, and was hailed by us as a forerunner of the end of our woes. The appearance of the moderately sized town, situated below the gulf, with vessels at anchor, and cattle grazing in the pastures that surrounded us, caused pleasure in which I participated, but which I cannot describe." Scarcely had the Boudous and the Etoile cast anchor, than the resident governor sent 2 soldiers to inquire of the French captain what reason he could assign for stopping at this place, when he must be aware that entrance was permitted to the ships of the India Company only. Bougainville immediately sent an officer to explain that hunger and sickness forced him to enter the first port which presented itself in his route. Also that he would leave Boton as soon as he had received the aid of which he had urgent need. The resident at once sent him the order of the governor of Amboyna, which expressly forbade his receiving any strange ship in his harbour, and begged Bougainville to make a written declaration of the reason for his putting into port, in order that he might prove to his superior that he had not infringed his orders except under paramount necessity. As soon as Bougainville had signed a certificate to this effect, cordiality was established with the Dutch. The resident entertained the officers at his own table, and a contract was concluded for provisions and fresh meat. bread gave place to rice, the usual food of the Dutch, and fresh vegetables which were not usually cultivated in the island were provided for the crews by the resident, who obtained them from the company's gardens. It would have been desirable for the re-establishment of the health of the crew, that the stay at this port could have been prolonged, but the end of the monsoon warned Bougainville to set out for Batavia. The captain left Boeton on the 7th of September, convinced that navigation in the Molucca archipelago was not so difficult as it suited the Dutch to affirm. As for trusting to French charts, they were of no use, being more qualified to mislead vessels than to guide them. Bougainville therefore directed his course through the Straits of Button and Saleyer, a route which, though commonly used by the Dutch, is but little known to other nations. The narrative therefore carefully describes, with mention of every cape, the course he took. We will not dwell upon this part of the voyage, although it is very instructive, and on that account interesting to seafaring men. On the 28th of September, 10 months and a half after leaving Montevideo, the Etoile and the Boudeuse arrived at Batavia, one of the finest colonies in the world. After touching at the Isle of France, the Cape of Good Hope, and Ascension Island, near which he met Carteret, Bougainville entered St. Malo on the 16th of February, 1769, having lost only 7 men, in the 2 years and 4 months which had elapsed since he left Nantes. The remaining particulars of the career of this fortunate navigator do not concern our purpose, and may be dismissed briefly. He took part in the American War, and in 1781 participated in an honourable combat before Port Royal off Martinique. Made chief of the fleet in 1780, he, 10 years later, received a commission to re-establish order in the mutinous fleet of M. d'Albert de Rion. Created vice-admiral in 1792, he did not think it right to accept a high rank, which was, to use his own words, "a title without duties." Nominated first to the Bureau of Longitudes, and then to the Institute, raised to the rank of senator, created a count by Napoleon I, Bougainville died full of years and honours on the 31st of August, 1811. Bougainville acquired popularity as the first Frenchman who accomplished a voyage round the world. Though the merit of discovering and reconnoitring, if not of exploring, many groups of islands little known and quite neglected before his time, has been ascribed to him, he owes his reputation rather to the charm and easy animation of his narrative than to his labours. If he is better known than any other French naval officers, his competitors, it is not so much because he accomplished more than they, as because his style of narrating his adventures charmed his contemporaries. As for Guyot Duclos, his secondary share in the enterprise and his plebeian rank excluded him from reward. He was afterwards given the Cross of St. Louis, but he earned the title by his rescue of the Belle Poule. Although he was born in 1722, and had been in the navy since the year 1734, he was still only lieutenant in 1791. A succession of ministers of new views was needed to obtain the rank of ship captain for him, a tardy recompense of long and signal services. Guyot Duclos died at St. Servan on the 10th March, 1794. End of Section 10.